Welcome to The Explainer. We're here to break down complex perspectives straight from the source. So today, we're diving into the worldview of Dutch commentator Jan Roos. He takes his own personal legal battles and connects them to a massive critique of modern society. And it all starts with this pretty intense statement. So the big question is, how does a person get from a controversial joke to a full-blown diagnosis of societal collapse? Let's unpack it. The story he tells starts with one single event that he says was the catalyst for this entire worldview.
Right, so this whole thing kicks off not with some violent crime or a major threat, but with a joke. A joke made on a satirical show. As you can see, what started as a joke really snowballed. It led to an arrest, and then 6 months of silence. Out of nowhere, the prosecutor comes back with an offer. Just apologize, and this whole thing goes away. But Roos refused. And that refusal is what set the wheels in motion for a full-on court battle. And his refusal really hinges on this principle. He looks at this conditional dismissal and sees a total contradiction. From his point of view, it's simple. A prosecutor either has a real case and they pursue it, or they don't and they drop it. He argues that the moment they demanded an apology, it proved the case was never really about justice, but about coercion. And here's the real kicker. According to him, Roos claims that the person the joke was actually about never filed a complaint. Their employer never filed a complaint. He alleges the public prosecutor just decided to take up the case all on their own, turning it into what he calls a personal hobby project. Okay, so this is the crucial pivot in his whole argument. For Roos, this stops being about just him and his joke. He uses it as Exhibit A to put what he sees as a deeply flawed and biased system on trial. He makes his point by pointing to what he sees as a massive double standard. On the one hand, he talks about protesters against pandemic measures being met with police force and getting injured. And on the other, he points to a large Black Lives Matter protest during lockdown, which the mayor of Amsterdam herself defended, saying it was too important to stop.
And he builds on this with another example he uses a lot. He contrasts the Blokkierfriesen who blocked a highway one time and were prosecuted, lost jobs, even had their DNA taken, with climate activists who repeatedly blocked a major highway, with the police, he claims, basically facilitating them. His conclusion is clear. The right to protest only seems to apply if you're protesting for a cause the establishment agrees with.
So from these very specific examples of what he calls systemic hypocrisy, Roos zooms way out. He starts to offer a much broader cultural diagnosis, not just of the Netherlands, but of the West in general. So why does he think he was targeted? Well, he presents this profile. In his view, he just happens to check all the boxes of traits that modern culture has decided are problematic. So being white, male, straight, outspoken, and politically incorrect makes him, in his own words, an easy target for the authorities. He argues that a key tactic of this sick society is misdirection. It's all about generalization. He claims that when a specific problem happens, caused by specific people, the conversation is immediately shifted to some vague, general concept to hide what's really going on. He uses the tragic murder of a teenager named Lisa as his prime example. The person who did it was an illegal asylum seeker. But in his analysis, the public conversation, which he says was led by politicians, immediately pivoted away from any failure of immigration policy and reframed it as a general problem of men. He sees that as a deliberate way to universalize the blame to protect a political agenda. Well, this all leads to a pretty fundamental question in his worldview. If the politicians we elect are just misdirecting everyone and what the people want seems to be totally ignored, who does he believe is actually running the country? He identifies what he describes as a five-headed monster of unelected power. It starts with the EU, whose treaties, he says, are placed above national law. Then you have activist judges, an unelected council of state, and a civil service that can just refuse to implement policies they don't like. And tying it all together is the media, which he sees not as a watchdog, but as a validator for the whole system. And he argues that this whole power structure operates completely against what the public wants. He points to the fact that trust in politicians has absolutely collapsed, as low as 4% in one study, as proof that people feel completely alienated from the powers that are actually governing them. So, given that diagnosis, a public with no power, ruled by an elite that can't be held accountable, his prognosis for the future is, well, pretty grim. He sees an inevitable confrontation on the horizon. He predicts that when people finally conclude that democratic channels like voting are totally useless, all that pressure is just going to build and build until something finally breaks. He believes the system has pushed people so far that some kind of radical reaction is unavoidable.
Now, he's clear that he doesn't want this to happen. He's not calling for it. Instead, he presents it as the logical, inevitable conclusion of the path we're on. He argues that if you ignore the population's core concerns for decades, you create a tinderbox, and he draws parallels to conflicts he's seen in other parts of Europe.
And he finishes his whole analysis not with an answer, but with this challenge. It's a very deliberate shift from diagnosis to a call for action. He's leaving it up to the audience to decide what that action should be, and to think about what the consequences of doing nothing might be. It's a provocative end to one man's journey from a single joke to a complete theory of societal collapse.